October 17, 1943, Camp Aliceville, Alabama, 2:47 a.m. The tin plate rattled against the table as the German prisoner tried to steady his hands. His knuckles looked like hinges under translucent skin. 3 years in the Afrika Korps had pared him down to the barest outline of a man. He knew the taste of sawdust bread that crumbled like dust between the teeth, and the bitter mock coffee brewed from roasted acorns. Now, a cook slid a tray in front of him. Scrambled eggs shining with butter, bacon curling at the edges, soft white bread spread thick with the real thing, coffee dark and sweetened with sugar and softened with cream. He stared like a man meeting a mirage. At capture, he weighed 128 pounds. In 2 years on American soil, he would climb to 185. 57 pounds he would later laugh about and lament in equal measure, a change that made his eyes disappear into new folds of flesh. His story was not an outlier, but a pattern stamped across the American map of World War II prisoner-of-war camps. During the war, more than 425,000 German servicemen were scattered across the United States in compounds ringed by barbed wire and lit by high lamps that hummed through the night. They arrived expecting cruelty, or at least indifference. They expected hunger. What they encountered instead was a sprawling machine of logistics and law. The 1929 Geneva Convention's Article 11, which required that prisoners of war be fed in quantity and quality equal to depot troops. For the American command, this was not only about morality, it was strategy. If German POWs ate well in Alabama and Kansas, then perhaps American prisoners in German hands would receive something better than the starvation rations common on the Eastern Front. The bodies that stepped off the ships in 1943 bore the stamp of a defeated supply chain. In Tunisia, where Axis forces capitulated in May, medical officers found men in biological retreat, gums bleeding from scurvy, eyes failing at dusk from vitamin A deficiency, ankles swollen with edema, signatures of a diet long on filler, short on fuel. The official field ration had been designed for hard campaigning, but by winter 1942, it was a shell of itself. Bread turned to hardtack when wheat ran short, then to a worm-speckled plank when even that supply thinned. Lunchtime tins promised meat, usually horse or mule, stretched with cellulose powder until it squeaked between the teeth. The morning brew was ersatz coffee flavored with saccharin. Evenings offered dehydrated vegetables that swelled in the stomach but nourished like paper. American doctors saw the collapse up close. A U.S. Army medical officer examining men at the North African embarkation centers wrote of walking ghosts, cheekbones jutting like shelf rock, ribs counting the seconds beneath the skin, some men too weak to climb the gangplanks without a hand under the elbow. The first meals aboard Liberty ships, the freighters that, at their production peak, carried roughly 30,000 prisoners to the U.S. each month, were small miracles and small shocks. Beef stew with potatoes and a slab of bread warm enough to fog the fingers. Butter that slid across the tongue. Coffee with real milk. For many, that first encounter ended over a railing. Starved stomachs revolt when offered prosperity too fast. The shipboard medics throttled the menu down, then back up, teaching bodies how to eat again. In the camps, food wasn't a gesture, it was a system. The office of the Provost Marshal General ran the program like a nationwide factory. Bi-monthly reports documented caloric targets, menu rotations, vitamin counts, and weight charts. Inspectors from Switzerland toured the kitchens. The Red Cross took notes. Quartermasters requisitioned bulk meat, sacks of flour, tins of vegetables, fresh produce in season, milk, butter, and barrels of coffee. Real coffee. The plan aimed for roughly 3,000 to 4,000 calories per day per man, not counting the extras POWs could buy with camp scrip, cigarettes, chocolate, beer, or wine where state law allowed, soda, ice cream. Kitchens worked around the clock. Bread came out in racks. Potatoes were peeled by the hundredweight. Coffee urns never rested. The results showed up in faces first, cheeks filling, eyes brightening, then on scale needles. One prisoner, whose letters home would later surface in an archive, recorded that leap from 128 to 185 pounds, a line that stuck with American officers because it seemed absurd until they looked around and saw it repeating. In Camp Hearn, Texas, the Fritz Ritz, locals joked, men built their own regional mess halls and tried to recreate the taste of home with American ingredients. The camp commander kept a simple policy he called calories for cooperation. Good behavior meant extra food and better commissary privileges. His report suggested average gains of roughly 45 pounds in 18 months. Camp Concordia, Kansas, spread over about 640 acres and housed around 4,000 men. There, kitchens with electric ranges and walk-in refrigerators turned out meals at an industrial scale. Mechanical dishwashers clattered. Flour dust rose in the air like snow. Many of the men had grown up with oil lamps and outhouses. Suddenly they found themselves in buildings wired with electric lights, running hot water, flush toilets, central heating, amenities that felt like science fiction to rural Europeans. The buildings went up in a matter of weeks, a display of speed and organization that impressed even those determined to stay unimpressed. And then there was Aliceville, the first stop for many captured in North Africa, a place where doctors crafted careful feeding regimens and watched diseases of deficiency melt away. A camp physician later wrote that the weight curve for most new arrivals came in phases, a tentative climb at first as digestive systems relearned how to break down fat and protein, a sharper rise in the second month, 8 to 10 pounds on average, followed by steady gains of 2 or 3 pounds per month for the next several months. Vitamin shortages resolved within 90 days. The dental clinic did brisk business, extractions and fillings and bridge work by the tens of thousands. Men who had never seen a dentist in peacetime suddenly sat under bright lamps while American and German dentists worked side by side. Not every change was simple or pleasant. Doctors began to chart conditions they associated with abundance rather than want. Hypertension, type 2 diabetes, gout cropping up in men who, months earlier, had hovered near collapse. There was a psychological weight, too. Letters and diaries spoke of a strange guilt. They ate well while their families rationed turnips and coal, and this fact sat on the stomach in a way even cream could not soothe. A camp chaplain described the Christmas in 1944, when turkey and ham and pies piled high, when local church groups sent cookies and scarves, when cups of cocoa refilled as quickly as men could drink them. Some prisoners cried in front of the plate. They thought of the Ardennes and of home. They ate anyway. They were guests and enemies and beneficiaries of a system they scarcely understood. For Americans on the home front, the sight of well-fed German prisoners rubbed like grit under the eyelid. Housewives counted ration points, queued for butter, stretched coffee, and then drove past a camp where the enemies of last week ate steak. Letters arrived on congressional desks in 1944 like thunderheads. A mother in Kansas wrote that her sons were fighting overseas while Nazis at the local camp seemed to live well. The War Department answered with the single argument that could be made: reciprocity. If Germany honored standards for American captives, it would not be because of kindness. It would be calculation, because in Texas and Ohio and Alabama, Americans kept to Geneva. The rules collided with American contradictions. In Texas, black soldiers reported watching German POWs sit down in restaurants where they themselves were refused service. One staff sergeant described standing in uniform with campaign ribbons gleaming and being told to go to the back door for a paper bag while the enemy sat to order. Prisoners saw this too, and some camp newspapers, which began as vehicles for Nazi slogans and gradually evolved into forums of debate, published blunt editorials about American segregation. The irony was ugly and instructive. Men captured while fighting for a dictatorship critiqued the democracy that fed them. Work programs pulled thousands of prisoners out of the wire each day, especially as the labor shortage pinched in 1944. They moved into the open fields of Nebraska and Texas, California's orchards, packing sheds, canneries. Farm breakfasts were legendary. Eggs and bacon and pancakes stacked like books, coffee that steamed in the morning air. Delivery trucks brought lunches out to the rows: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, vegetables, pie, ice water, and lemonade for the August heat. Supper back in camp. On heavy workdays, some men consumed upward of 5,000 calories. The pounds returned quickly. The work itself reoriented whatever ideas many had brought from home. In Nebraska's sugar beet fields, one farmer on a tractor with mechanical cultivators could do in an hour what a village had done in a day by hand. In the cotton fields of Texas, the heat was punishing, but the breaks were regular and the water never ran out. A foreman told a crew that hungry men were poor workers, and the men, between mouthfuls, nodded. In California's Central Valley, prisoners picked peaches and oranges and watched in disbelief as surplus fruit was bulldozed into trenches when the market sagged. One worker begged the farmer to send it to Europe. The farmer shook his head. The numbers didn't pencil out. The sight of abundance pushed to waste etched itself into memory as deeply as hunger ever had. Some prisoners encountered American industry up close. At a soup plant, conveyor belts moved an unending river of cans, one line outpacing what a German factory might have produced in a day. Near Detroit's Willow Run, they heard that B-24 bombers rolled off the line roughly every 63 minutes, a pace beyond comprehension to men who had watched mechanics hand-fit panels under bombardment. A steel mill roared with 10,000 tons of output each day. An engineer from Cologne calculated in his head and felt his stomach drop. This was not a duel between equals, but a contest between production systems. Even tactical brilliance couldn't overcome that math forever. Escapes happened, but they were rare. Of the 425,000 men held, around 2,222 attempts were recorded, a fraction of a fraction, and the number who vanished for good could be counted on one hand. Georg Gartner, who slipped out of Camp Deming, New Mexico in September 1945, became legend as Hitler's last soldier in America, living under the name Dennis Wiles for decades before giving himself up in 1985. Most attempts resembled the Papago Park caper in Arizona, where 25 U-boat officers spooned out a 178-foot tunnel under a volleyball court and planned a waterborne dash to Mexico down the Salt River. The riverbed was dry. Hunger greeted them instead of victory. Within weeks, all were back, some turning themselves in exchange for a hot meal. One of the planners later admitted the obvious. Inside meant food, shelter, movies, and soccer games. Outside was a desert that did not care about ideology. Education grew inside the wire, as steadily as waistlines. Across the country, more than 50,000 prisoners attended classes. Camp Concordia alone offered around 300 subjects. Local professors came through the gates to teach American history, agriculture, mechanics, philosophy. In some camps, physics labs were stocked better than pre-war German universities, and a few instructors were scholars who had fled Germany themselves. The curriculum did not try to brainwash. It did something more effective. It handed out banned books and let men argue about them. They read Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, traced the logic in the Federalist Papers, debated constitutions, and then walked to the mess hall to stand in a line made possible by ample supply and transparent accounting. The camp newspapers morphed from chest-thumping propaganda to journals that argued about Germany's future. A former officer wrote later that he and many of his peers arrived as true believers and left as tentative converts to democracy, not because anyone shouted them down, but because they had lived inside a system that criticized itself in public and still kept the lights on. The human ties surprised everyone. Regulations against fraternization did what regulations do. They drew a line that people stepped across. Work details created acquaintances. Letters followed. After the war, over 1,000 former prisoners married American women they had met during or shortly after captivity. About 5,000 would eventually immigrate, trading old uniforms for new lives. Others went home and kept up a correspondence with families who had, in their words, treated the enemy like a neighbor. When repatriation surged between 1945 and 1946, ships carried roughly 370,000 men back across the Atlantic. Men heavier by millions of combined pounds. Men whose belts had moved outward. Men who had discovered that a full belly could feel complicated. They stepped ashore into cities smashed by bombardment, into houses where children's ribs showed, into ration lines where 1,550 daily calories counted as luck. The American weight, as some called it, slid away in months, 30, 40, 50 pounds burning off like fog under a hard sun. One returnee wrote that he had given his portion to his children and survived on peels and the occasional stolen bite of grain. Better, he wrote, to have never learned the sensation of fullness than to know it and lose it. Yet, not everything slipped away. The techniques learned in American fields and factories came home tucked inside memory. Former POWs replicated planting schedules, fertilizers, irrigation methods. In the first 5 post-war years, German crop yields rose sharply, and part of that jump came from practices picked up behind American wire. Management habits filtered into workshops. Men who had watched an assembly line produce a bomber per hour tried to make a lathe sing a little faster. The social education took root too. The camp-born habit of debate, of treating argument as fuel rather than threat, pushed some veterans toward political parties and union halls that favored Reconstruction and Western partnership over Soviet promises. Economists would later call the program almost self-funding. It cost hundreds of millions to build and staff the camps, feed and house the prisoners, provide medical and dental care, supervise work. But the labor they performed harvested crops that might otherwise have rotted and kept canneries, sawmills, and factories humming. The strategic return, though, dwarfed the monetary math. Every well-treated prisoner was a quiet message to the enemy. This is what we can afford to do, even during total war. It was also a message to the world the U.S. hoped to influence when the firing stopped. The contradictions never resolved cleanly. Some American communities resented feeding enemy soldiers steak, while neighbors struggled to find butter. Black veterans remembered being told to wait at the back door, while the defeated were seated at tables. And yet, many Germans, having experienced that very contradiction, returned home wary of the ideology that had promised them greatness while delivering hunger. "We finally understood American power," one man wrote years later. "It wasn't only in their weapons, but in their surplus." Another put it more bluntly. "Every pound I gained was a pound of the old beliefs I lost." The records are full of small scenes that make large points. A corporal in Kansas sends extra rolls out the back door to a work detail and tells them to pass them around in the truck because men work better on a full stomach. A Kansas grandmother knits a scarf for a man who, months earlier, had manned a machine gun. A Nebraska farmer shakes his head at the mountain of potatoes left to rot and mutters that markets are merciless, then loads his truck again for town. An American officer fills out yet another set of forms tallying meat, milk, butter, bread, calories, weight, vitamins, inspections, a bureaucracy that fed even its enemies because it believed the paperwork would, in time, purchase peace. And peace did come, imperfect and partial, and then prosperity. In 1985, at a reunion in Texas, hundreds of former prisoners returned with children and grandchildren to the country that had locked its gates behind them and set places for them at long tables. One speaker said what many felt. They had arrived as enemies and left as something else. "We came starving," he said. "We left heavier. Our bodies, yes, but also our ideas." A colonel who had fought from Poland to Africa wrote afterward that no lecture he had ever heard beat the argument made by a stocked pantry, a hot shower, a newspaper free to criticize, and a line of men who could grumble about the coffee and then pour another cup. It is tempting to say, in the end, that America's most devastating weapon in that war glinted in steel or roared in octane. The ledger tells a different story. The most persuasive instrument of power turned out to be the dinner table, long enough to seat strangers, laden enough to astonish men who had forgotten the feel of satiety, organized enough to serve millions of meals on time, every time. The camps proved a paradox and a lesson, that in a world of ration cards and ruin, a nation could be strong by being generous, could turn enemies into witnesses simply by letting them eat. By October of 1943, when that prisoner in Aliceville blinked at his plate and tried to steady the fork, the outlines of this quiet strategy were already visible. Barbed wire framed the scene, guards walked their patterns, and the lights kept the Alabama night at bay. He lifted the first bite of eggs to his mouth. Butter, salt, heat. The taste rose through his chest like a memory of childhood. He swallowed and felt something unfamiliar spread through him. Call it relief, call it confusion. Call it the first small revision of a worldview. Months later, he would boast and complain about the extra weight, the way his cheeks puffed into his eyes. Years later, he would tell his children about the country that had fed him while fighting him, the place where he learned that prosperity could be a form of persuasion, and that a full belly could be a truth you could not argue with. Not far from where he sat that night, a clerk leaned over a daily report and wrote the numbers in neat columns. Breakfast totals. Coffee consumed. Pounds of flour. The clerk did not know his lines would become a kind of evidence. But they did. They became proof that a bureaucracy can be humane, that a treaty paragraph can shape a body, that a nation confident in its capacity can afford to be magnanimous and can profit by it. The ledger closed for the day, the lights hummed, the Arkansas stars were hidden by the glare, and a campful of former enemies slept with the rare comfort of knowing what was for breakfast.